books, you welcome back to my channel. It's been almost a week since I posted my video where I talked about my 2019 favorite new releases. Today we're here to talk about my 2019 favorite backlist books. I thought when I posted that first video that I'd be able to make the next video the next day, but this little one, she's been taking up a lot more of my time lately. It seems like as she grows older, she wants to spend less and less time on her own. She just wants to be here for everything. And I know there are some people who would say that I should put her down and leave her be, but that's not how I was raised. My mom took me with her everywhere she went. I went to her teachers' meetings with her. I learned how to sit in a corner and amuse myself and read and do puzzles and so on. So I'm hoping that by her being with me, she'll learn a little bit of that, a little bit of an attachment to me, but maybe also pick up some of my better habits. So in any case, today we're here to talk about my favorite backlist books that I read last year. And I read a lot of books, most of them were backlist, but I had 8 that really stood out that even now, almost at the end of January, I'm still thinking about and wanting to mention here. And I'm not ranking these in any order. I'm just going to tell you the books in the order in which I read them. The first of those books is The Elected Member by Bernice Rubens, and that was a 1970 Booker Prize winner. And the story is about a Jewish family. Well, the parents are immigrants and the children are first generation immigrants living in London. They're living in England. In any case, the oldest son, the firstborn son, in the Jewish tradition, the person who's supposed to carry on the legacy of the family, he's had some kind of a mental breakdown and he's having hallucinations. But the father, who's a Jewish rabbi, and the person who's supposed to be teaching the preservation of the religion to his family, but also to the rest of the members of the congregation, the father is torn between believing in his son's hallucination versus his belief in God. It's like there's a little bit of an exploration of faith versus fantasy. Like in our reality, we expect that we have to be able to see things in order to believe them, but how can you say that you believe in God if you can't also believe in the spiritual things that other people say? I love the Jewish references that the author included in the book. Everything from the naming of the characters to situations that they found themselves in, which mirrored stories from the Bible. I absolutely loved her treatment of the book. There was one thing about the book that I didn't love. There was an instance of incest which I thought was unnecessary, but we've also seen many examples of incest in the Bible, and so I thought that a book that commented on society and family and ambition and our history of, God bless you, our history of what we know of immigrants, but specifically Jewish immigrants, and the preservation of their legacy in other societies. I thought she did a really good job of mirroring that in the book among these characters' lives, and I loved it. So that was the first backlist book that I read last year that made it onto my favorites, The Elected Member by Bernice Rubens. And I'm sorry that I don't have copies to hold up for you right now. Some of these are books that I own, they're on my shelves, but I can't hold the books and hold the baby. So books, baby over books this time. The second book that I read last year that made it onto my list of favorites was Girls Burn Brighter by Shobha Rao, and that is set in India and follows 2 young women who are from very poor families who meet and fall into sisterhood and form a bond that transcends all the other relationships in their lives. And they become separated eventually because their lives take different paths. But through the divergence of those paths, we get to see the different ways that a poor young woman could move forward in life in that society, and what are some of the harsh realities of that existence, and how the relationships that you choose and the relationships that you are forced into, how they affect your life. What I really loved about the book was the author's treatment of the divergence of those 2 paths and how those 2 women fought their circumstances in order to try to reconnect with each other. But also, the book is kind of an ironic take on the title, Girls Burn Brighter. The word burn, we can think about burning with passion, burning with potential. And also a physical burning, something that is negative. And I loved how the author explored the potential of all those different meanings of burning. Like we think about the ritualistic burning of the Hindu peoples and what that might mean for a woman who is considered lesser valued than her husband, that if something happens to her husband, she's supposed to be burned along with him when he's cremated. And the book was just so profound in so many ways because of the author's exploration of those different iterations of the word. It was a very sad and moving story, but one that I'm still thinking about even months after I read it. The third book on my list is West by Karis Davis. This is a 2018 release, which was introduced to me because I was judging the BookTube prize last year. So this is not quite an old book. Hey, this is what you wanted, remember? You like this. You just want to talk? Okay, tell them something. You want to tell them your favorite book from last year? But now I tell you to talk, you don't want to talk. Okay, so you're going to be quiet? Okay. The next book that I wanted to mention here was West by Karis Davis, which is not an old book. In fact, it's a 2018 release. And it was introduced to me last year because it was one of the nominees for the BookTube prize and it appeared on a list that I was judging from. And this is kind of historical fiction. It's set during a time when people were leaving Europe and moving to the United States, setting up homesteads and farms. And our main character, Cy Bellman, sets up a mule breeding farm, but it doesn't cure his desire for exploring. So he decides to follow the myths of these large animals that the Lewis and Clark expedition failed to prove. And the book compares the excursions that this man takes going west, compares the dangers that he faces with the dangers that his daughter faces when he leaves her at home to kind of take care of herself. And I love the allegory that the author provided of United States history, where she had this white man following the paths that so many before him had taken, where he needed the assistance of Native Americans. And it showed the relationship that whites and these natives had, where there was exploitation but also protection on both sides. And I just loved a lot of the elements of history that the author interwove into the texture of this novel. And I loved how sparsely written it was because it was such a small novel but accomplished so much. So that was one of my favorites from last year. Not an old book, but definitely a backlist because it wasn't published last year. Next is The Story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Roblowski, which was a 2008 release, and it was on Oprah's book club back then, but I hadn't heard of it until my friend sent me a copy and said, you should read this. So I read it and I loved it. It's about a boy who's born on a farm in rural Wisconsin, I think. His parents are dog breeders. And even though his parents are adept at teaching dogs how to communicate with each other and to communicate with humans, their son is born mute. And because of his unique circumstances, he learns how to communicate with his parents and also with animals in a nonverbal way. And I loved the way the author wrote. The sentences in that book was just so poignant. But even more than that, even more than the communication that the boy was able to achieve with living beings, his parents and other human characters, but also with the dogs in the novel. I also loved the written communication that we were able to explore because previous residents had left letters, and so I just love the way the author explored communication, how stories can be told through lots of different means. I loved the heartwarming situations and sentences that were written. There was just so much to love about the writing in this book. I didn't love everything about the book when I was reading it. In fact, when it was finished, I was very upset at how it ended, and so I reduced my rating to a 4 stars. But after some time had passed, the book just stayed in my memory. The story of Edgar Sawtelle just kind of gnawed away at my heart. And so weeks after I'd closed the book, I revised my rating. I know that it has to be a 5-star read just because of the impact that it made on me, the story that it told, how it told it, and what it achieved even after it was over. So The Story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Roblowski, my 4th favorite backlist book from last year. No, fourth on my list of backlist favorites from my 2019 reading. These are not in any order, right? Oops, I forgot to mention The Known World by Edward P. Jones, which is a 2003 Pulitzer Prize winner, I think. I did read that earlier in the year, so I should have spoken about it earlier in the video, but since these are not in any particular order, it doesn't matter. In any case, The Known World is set in the South at the latter part of slavery, and we're following people who are engaged with the subject of slavery from lots of different angles. We meet a man who was a former slave himself, and after he was emancipated, he became a landowner, a plantation owner, and started owning slaves himself. And that is a story that first came to me in Paul Beatty's The Sellout, and I did not like how that novel treated that subject of black people owning slaves. But Edward P. Jones's take on it was just so different, where he clearly showed the need for owning property, owning human property as chattels in order to live and thrive in that environment. He talked about how, I mean, it was just such a difficult subject to really grasp. The idea that after you had left a situation behind, that you could enforce it onto other people. But, you know, in the writing, in the novel, he does show the complexity of relationships, the relationships between blacks of different stations in life, whether they were enslavers or enslaved. He shows the relationship between whites and blacks, between people of mixed race, and how they would want to engage with one group, but they're forced to engage with another, or how they kind of have to stay by themselves because they're in the middle of these two very different groups that have nothing in common with each other. I mean, there was just so much texture, so much gravitas to this book. It's one that I plan to reread at some point, because when I was reading it, I was taking notes to share with my buddy readers, but I didn't make notes in the book myself, and I regret that. So it's one that I would recommend other people to read, and when you're reading it, I recommend that you take notes for yourself, because there's just so much about this book to appreciate, so much to delve into, so much about this book. The next book that I wanted to mention was A House for Mr. Biswas by V.S. Naipaul, which was first published in 1961. This one is set in V.S. Naipaul's native Trinidad, and it is kind of an allegory for the experience of the island republic of Trinidad and Tobago, but also on a much wider scale, the colonized countries in their bid to finding their own identity. The main character in this one is a young man of, well, he's not very young, but he's a man of Indian descent, in that his family would have migrated from India to the West Indies as indentured servants, and eventually setting up their own brand of identity and culture, in that they retained some of the relics of their religion and their culture from India, but also integrating to the extent of taking on what they needed from their current position so that they could get ahead in society. And so we have examples of these families sending their children to Catholic schools in order to get the education that they would need to push their family and themselves ahead. I also really enjoyed the author's treatment of residence, how one goes about looking for a place to inhabit, and what that looks like when you've found the perfect place to rest. All these different examples of homes and houses, and inheriting a place versus working towards making or buying your own place, and what that looks like, how it feels to occupy these different spaces. I thought that that was such a really great way of treating the idea of these island nations that had to shrug off colonization and try to become their own country, become their own people. I thought that the author did a really good job of comparing the life of a man with the life of a country. And so that was one of my favorite reads from last year, backlist or otherwise, just one of my favorite reads, hands down. Then there was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which is a 1938 publication. And my only regret about this book is that I hadn't read it before. The story is about a young woman who marries an older man who's been widowed. Even though she's married him, she doesn't quite feel secure in their relationship. She doesn't feel like she measures up to him. And she certainly doesn't feel like she measures up to this man's previous wife, his now deceased wife. And so even though she moves into their home, a home that she lusted after before even meeting her now husband, she's intimidated by the legacy that this former mistress left. And I love the author's exploration of the comparison between reality and how we can construct ideas in our minds and be tortured by our own thoughts. I loved how she explores the psyche and, you know, kind of shows the evolution and the devolution of a relationship based on things that we tell ourselves. And so I really loved her exploration of the characters. I love the fact that the novel is named after a person who's not there to defend themselves, but they are peopled by how other people speak of them. And so it was just such an interesting look at legacy and reality versus fantasy, reality versus memory. And I just love the way that the author talked about people, the people that we met in the pages and the people that they spoke about as well. The next book that I wanted to mention was Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which was the 2009 Booker Prize winner. And there are a lot of things that I loved about this book. This is also historical fiction set in the Tudor period, where we're following the story of Henry VIII wanting to divorce his wife so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. And because at the time Henry was a representative of the Christian church in England and the Pope refused to give him that divorce, it leads to the split between the Church of England and the Christian Catholic Church. I loved the fact that this was history unfolding in front of our eyes, but also history being reported through the eyes of Thomas Cromwell. I loved the author's treatment of this story in that she revises the persona that Cromwell has probably maintained in historical relics, in how he's remembered as being very austere, perhaps, and very power hungry. And instead, the author chooses to show us still a very influential man, but also a very personal one, showing him espousing his duty in his interactions, in his political interactions, but also showing a very charismatic, a very kind, very warm man in his personal life, showing love, kindness to people for almost no reward. But I also love the way that the author shows a different side to these characters through some of the decisions that Cromwell has to make, through some of his political machinations, some of what he tries to accomplish, trying to save people even though they're refusing to save themselves. I also love her treatment of the history, in that what we now know or believe in our present time, we see people being burned as heretics for it during this period. And so I just loved Mantel's comparison, her juxtaposition of present and past, and history, historical opinion, historical fact, historical perspective being formed by personal decisions, personal biases. I also love the way that she presented the characters. There was so much tenderness presented in a book that otherwise seemed to be about pursuing personal ambition and killing anyone who stood in your way. I love the way that the author accomplished what she did, which is presenting history in a very real way, to the point where I wasn't sure whether what she was presenting to me was history or her own made up story. I love the fact that the author gave me a story that made it so that I didn't care what was history anymore. And so those are my 8 favorite backlist books that I read last year. I'd love to get your recommendations. If you have some backlist favorites that you think I should be reading, books that may be similar to ones that I mentioned here, or just your favorite backlist books from last year or previous years that you think I should check out. Go ahead, leave me a link to your video down below, or give me a list, a roundup, so I can check them out. I'm planning to be reading a lot of new releases this year because I am judging the BookTube prize again, but I always have room in my life for backlist books. So I'd love to chat with you in the comments down below. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll talk down there. So until next time, happy reading. Bye.